When Russia invaded Ukraine in late February 2022, many people expected a quick Russian victory. Analysts, Ukrainian generals, and probably even Putin himself.
The sheer correlation of forces on the ground makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to stand up to the Russians.
The Ukrainian government doing everything they can to protect the Ukrainian capital, but it is not looking good as Russian forces start to encircle that city.
The sheer size and strength of Russia's forces compared to Ukraine's seemed to all but guarantee a swift conquest. But as of the day of this recording, much of Ukraine continues to hold out, including the capital, Kyiv. To explain how, I spoke to two experts, Elliot Ackerman and Jason Dempsey. With decades of experience in the United States military between them and subsequent careers covering war as journalists and analysts, they broke down Putin's invasion for me into 4 key concepts. First, let's talk numbers, or more accurately, how they can deceive. From the size of the armies to the number of tanks to total military spending, Russia dwarfs Ukraine. And they've been building up a military presence on Ukraine's border since annexing Crimea back in 2014. So on paper, it looks like an easy Russian victory.
We thought at first that just by sheer numbers, they'd be able to completely roll over the country fairly quickly.
Russia's hopes was that the central government in Ukraine would quickly collapse, that the Ukrainian people would not have an appetite to put up a real resistance, and that they would be able to install a puppet regime relatively quickly.
But it turns out that strength on paper doesn't necessarily translate to strength in the battlefield.
The Russians, Putin particularly, who thought that he had this large army that was also competent, and those are two separate things, right? A large army is one thing, a large army that's competent is something completely different.
Russia invaded on 3 axes, from the east through the Donbas region, from the south through coastal Crimea, and from the north towards Kyiv via Belarus. While the southern and eastern invasions have made inroads into Ukraine, the north has been slow and described in terms like baffling, bizarre, and, well,
they're wildly incompetent thus far.
This is a sign of undiscipline.
And again, it's sort of unconscionable that this would happen.
So if there's a bigger strategic blunder in modern military history, I can't think of it.
As the Russians are finding out, even just running basic logistics, for operations lasting longer than 2 to 3 days, exceedingly hard.
We've seen a degree of underperformance in their logistics and their ability to keep vehicles on the road. There have been photos of, many Russian trucks with flat tires. There's also been the issue of gaining and maintaining air superiority in Ukraine, which they have thus far been unable to do.
Ackerman and Dempsey added that this falls on poorly trained Russian soldiers, many of whom are conscripts, not volunteers.
The American military never conducts exercises this big. We try to, but we train the heck out of it nonstop. It's the trap of high-tech weapon systems, thinking that that's going to be the magic bullet. The way high-tech weapon systems work is they're never the magic bullet. They work in this complex web that fits in with a bunch of other high-tech weapon systems that require a crazy amount of training to coordinate.
So it almost sounds like what you're saying, if I can sum it up, is that you can have as many troops and weapons and tanks lined up at the Ukrainian border as you want, but if they're not operated by skilled people who know what they're doing, it's kind of going to fall apart.
Right, and these folks were the most trained, the most prepared, the most ready to go in, and they're wildly incompetent thus far.
Wildly incompetent, and it seems ill-prepared for the type of urban fighting that highly developed cities like Kyiv require. With tall buildings, subway lines, and a population that is highly motivated to fight back, Kyiv is fertile ground for guerrilla-style resistance.
We've all seen the images of residents making Molotov cocktails, and one might roll your eyes and say, well, what's a Molotov cocktail going to do against a tank? Well, if you're being forced to go house by house, room by room to clear out these cities, and if the Russians meet a true determined resistance, they can do quite a lot of damage.
Which leads me to the next big idea, morale. Despite all this incompetence, the Russian army has made progress. But when they confront Ukrainians directly, they're hit with what Ackerman and Dempsey both emphasized as possibly the most important ingredient of all.
There is a very real and very staunch Ukrainian nationalism that exists, and their sense of resentment towards the Russians now has been building over the better part of a decade.
But Russian propaganda led soldiers to believe that they would be greeted as liberators from a corrupt government in Kyiv, a sentiment that couldn't be further from the truth. This is a graph of the percentage of Ukrainians that have a positive view of Russia. See that drop in 2014? That happened after Russia annexed Crimea, and sentiment has remained negative ever since.
Napoleon, one of his maxims was that in war, the morale is to the material as 3 is to 1. You cannot underestimate the importance of moral factors in war.
That morale, combined with a wildly popular president, tons of weaponry from Western countries, and 8 years of preparation, has allowed Ukraine to hold out.
Putin's dream scenario essentially would be sort of a blitzkrieg capture of Kyiv, and yet if that was the original goal, why invade Crimea 8 years ago?
Yeah,
there's 8 years to practice.
Yeah, it was almost an ideal dynamic for the Ukrainians. They got punched in the face, and the bully said, "I'm coming back." And then they had 8 years to think about, okay, what do I do?
And really, I think the macro question in all of this is, in the military, we have this idea of troops to task. What that means is, how many troops have you allocated to perform whatever the task is? And so the troops to task, if the task is conquering all of Ukraine, the Russians have allocated about 200,000 troops to do that. But are 200,000 troops enough to subdue a population of some 40 million Ukrainians who do not want to be occupied?
But as much as I've hyped up Ukrainian spirit and skill, they can't reasonably expect to hold out forever, especially with an increasingly frustrated Putin running the show.
I think Putin is angry and frustrated right now. He's likely to double down and try to grind down the Ukrainian military with no regard for civilian casualties.
Which leads me to the final big idea: endgame. As the likelihood of an immediate Ukrainian surrender shrinks, Russian forces seem to be switching tactics. If they initially expected a quick surrender from a more receptive Ukrainian population, they now seem to be settling in for a longer-term war of attrition, featuring more vicious tactics like indiscriminate bombing and laying siege to key cities. This type of warfare is devastating to both sides, but Putin technically has the resources to keep the fight going. For a historical parallel, think of the lengthy wars the US fought in Vietnam and Afghanistan. To avoid those scenarios, what Putin needs right now is this: an off-ramp.
If the Ukrainians refuse to be conquered, and it seems they are refusing to be conquered, it's very difficult to conquer them. So I don't see how the Russians get out of this.
Basically, Putin needs a way to exit this war that allows him to save face without either destroying Ukraine entirely or triggering a fiercer response from the West.
But as Putin has articulated, he believes that the Ukrainian people and the Russians are one people and that they should be reunited. I would wager that he believes that he either needs to grow his territorial holdings or die as a president. That that the growth of his territorial holdings is important for the future success of his presidency.
It's like there's a bully in a bar, and he's picking on somebody. None of us like it, but he's got a gun in his waistband. And so it's like, well, how do you navigate this bully in the bar without escalating to a lot more people dying?
I also think it's a mistake for us to, and by us I mean the West and NATO, to simply shrug our shoulders and say, isn't it admirable that the Ukrainians are so brave, and think that we can rely upon their bravery and their bravery alone to keep Russia from rolling up the entire country. It would be foolish to believe that if Putin is successful in Ukraine, that he will stop there.